Wasatch Report, shooting straight on everything from prepping to politics.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wasatch Report. I am Suzanne Sherman, your host for the next hour. Joining me in the control room in our virtual studio is Jeff Johnson. He'll be brought in as soon as he's done doing his work behind the scenes, checking all our levels, making sure everything is working properly. This is a Cerberus Radio Network where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank those of you that are giving your constant support and encouragement to us. We really appreciate it. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Cerberus Radio Network, assuming you can get Facebook to work. I am absolutely dead in the water right now. And the tricky thing for me is because we don't have the phone working right now, people can send messages and participate in the show via that. I mean, that is not available, but we do have, don't despair, we have a YouTube channel, and that is up and running. So far, so good. And we have a chat room in there. So join us in the in the YouTube chat, and you can contribute and share your ideas there. And Jeff will read those aloud and share them with us as well. So we have the YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe, to follow us on there. Our shows also get uploaded to SoundCloud, so you can download those for free. We do not have a paywall. We do not charge for downloads. All we ask is that if you like what you hear, please share it with your friends. And we're really trying to get a unique message out. We have some great options for you to listen to. If you go to our website, our Facebook page, assuming you can open it, we have a use app link, and it will take you to Radio Co. We have content 24/7. Mark and Suzanne show, Revolutionizing Radio. Mark Kreslins and I do a show, again, with Jeff joining in. Junk Bond was with us yesterday. And we have a message for you on this network that you're not going to hear on the other shows. We ask you to shift paradigms and think in a way that you're not going to hear again on Fox News, Mark Levin, any of these people. You know, this whole going back and forth and fighting the Democrats, cheering on the Republicans, it's really not getting us anywhere. We like to talk about principles instead of hanging on to this Constitution. Go back to the Declaration of Independence. Think about consent of the governed. Is what we have now representative towards you, towards what you believe in? Or is it time to maybe think of other solutions, maybe decentralization? I want to encourage you to go to yesterday's show, and that was the Mark and Suzanne show, Revolutionizing Radio. We had Marcus Ruiz Evans, I beg your pardon, from Yes, California, part of the Cal Exit movement. And he is proof positive that you don't have to fight people with whom you disagree on fundamental principles of governing. For instance, conservatism versus liberalism. This gentleman is a liberal. He is from California. We disagree with him philosophically, but we do agree that we should have the ability to enjoy the values under which we want to live and not force them upon other states in this union. So we encourage you to join us in this endeavor as we try to really educate people on this process. It is an uphill battle. Conservatives and progressives alike are very threatened by this because they really don't want to have this change. And it's not going to be easy, and there are going to be some bumps in the roads, but that's why I also encourage preparedness. I think if we can tie the two together and let people know, look, whether or not this is a cause from a shift in our system of government or a natural disaster or even a personal issue where maybe you lose a job, if you can be prepared and not have to rely on somebody else, whatever's going to go wrong in your life, you can probably weather it better if you are prepared. That being said, I do have someone joining me in the studio today, our very good friend, Greg Carpenter, and he has also Liberty Minutes on his show. We're going to get some updates on his latest releases on his show. And I want to encourage you to go on to our SoundCloud page and listen to those. They're absolutely amazing. In fact, we're going to add one of his elements of that I was not expecting to discuss today, connected with our California fire situation. So I want to talk a little bit about these California fires. As we know, they have absolutely been wreaking havoc in the state of California, and there's pointing back and forth. Well, it's Trump's fault because the federal government controls so much of the land in California. Oh, it's California's fault because of their environmental policies. And I have to say, it's probably a combination of both. I know Jerry Brown, the governor of California, had vetoed some legislation that would have provided some forest management that would have made it so these fires weren't so bad as they were. I remember when I lived there, I lived in a community called San Martin. It was between Morgan Hill and Gilroy. And it was in an agricultural zone. And we had a pasture with some horses. And as I went back there one morning to feed them, I was looking due west towards the coast over the mountains. And it's not uncommon to see banks of fog looking in that direction. Well, I was looking at this one big bank of what I thought was fog, and I thought, I am really glad that that is not a fire, because if it were, that would absolutely be devastating. And as I'm looking at this, what I thought was a cloud bank, I start to see that the smoke is billowing, and it's not the typical color of the fog. It was more that brownish orangey tinge, and it turned out it was a massive fire going on in the coastal community called Aptos. And it was absolutely devastating. And the reason the fire got so out of control was people had tried to take down some of these eucalyptus trees. They're all over the place there. It's essentially kerosene on a stick. And they were not allowed to take these down. And the result was absolute devastation. And it seems like California never, ever learns from their policies. So you can go back and forth all you want. The bottom line is, if this is California's policies in and of themselves, and that's what the people want, that's one thing. The problem is, again, when they make these bad decisions, they come running to the federal government seeking financial assistance. And so what really matters, though, if you're living in that situation or come across it, is to survive. Number one key to survival is get out of the way. So if you do live in an area, again, I want to tie in some preparedness in this show today. If you do live in an area, and most of us do, where a wildfire can be an issue, and anybody living in a home also has to deal with issues with fire. So the first issue, have a plan. Have a plan for your family. What are you going to do if there's a fire? Do you know how you can get your family together? Think about that before the time actually comes. What if you need to escape your home? Are there some important papers or important valuables you need to take with you? Have them ready to go. Have a go bag for the family that you can take out and go somewhere if you need to in an emergency, where you have the essentials for your children, everybody in the family, anybody that has specific needs or medication. Very, very important. Think about evacuation routes. The roads that you might consider, or the roads that you might need to take, might be blocked. I don't know, Greg, if you and Jeff saw this, but there were some videos out there on Facebook and YouTube of people driving through this fire, and it was miraculous to me that some of them even made it through. Did you guys see any of that?
I didn't see any of that. I have been in forest fires before. Part of my duty with the Army, I was sent to Idaho back in 1989 to fight the forest fires up there. And I have to admit, it is one terrifying situation. One thing I did learn while up there, though, if you are stuck in place and you can't get out, you need to control burn everything within 50 to 65 feet of your house, to make a buffer zone in order to save your house. The heat might be intense around you, but the house will stand and the house won't burn down. If you don't burn the stuff out from around your house, that stuff's just going to get burned anyways, and your house is going to be part of it. And again, if you can't get out, if you're surrounded, well, odds are you're going to be part of that too. Jeff, have you seen any of those videos?
I didn't see the videos. I did read some articles about people that did not survive the evacuation because they tried to drive through the fires and they were killed in these fires. So that was what I was going to say. You were talking about the evacuation, Suzanne. If you're going to evacuate, make sure you do it soon enough. Don't wait till the last second. Don't wait till the fire's on top of you and you're putting your family and yourself at risk trying to get out. Get out ahead of time. It's no different than hurricanes. When people hear these evacuations for hurricanes, what do? They wait to the last second, and then people get hurt or have to put their lives in danger to rescue people. And I saw some stories about people that were rescued by people in out in California. So people put their lives at risk to save others because they waited too long. And as for what you're saying, Greg, about that burning things back, yes, you can burn things back. Be sure you know your local ordinances on that, because some places there's burn bans, especially when there's lots of fires. You may not be allowed to burn it when it's so dry, but also just get the dead stuff out. If you can't burn it, get all those dead branches, all the dead leaves out. Use a little tractor. If you have a lawn tractor, put a blade on it, push it out, use it like a little bulldozer, clean up the stuff around your house, just clean it up. And I don't know what New York or California's laws on this are. Again, all these environmental things, they couldn't cut the eucalyptus trees. That's something else you can do, is cut some of the trees around your house, thin it down a little bit so that there's less fuel to burn, especially if they're dead trees. Get them out.
Yeah, and even then, think about the landscaping that you want to have around your house. Is it something that's going to act as a barrier, or is it something that's going to encourage fires to get really up close? Jeff, you've been to my place. You see that there's only so much I can do with the fields around me, but even in my backfield, we've done burns there to keep that grass down. This year, I actually was mowing it down. Would it still catch fire? Yeah, but it wouldn't be as dangerous as had I not done any kind of maintenance towards there. As for the lawn in front of my home, I try to always keep that irrigated and keep it wet. But if a large fire came through here and I couldn't escape, I have a creek behind my house, try and get under there and get in some water and give yourself a shelter. I'm actually looking at, and maybe with your experience as a firefighter, you can tell me if this is worth it or not. But you see that the firefighters have those emergency portable shelters that they could get under if they get caught. Because I was telling my son, I thought I should invest in that. He says, oh, just go out on the gravel because we have an open area. But you don't know if the fire's bad enough, if there's going to be oxygen available to you as it goes through. And at least with these little tent shelters, that save some oxygen for when it goes by. Do you think that's a viable solution for somebody that lives in an area where they may or may not be able to escape from a fire?
It certainly wouldn't hurt. I know exactly what you're talking about. I've taken the federal firefighter training for the hot shots. Never deployed with hot shots, so I'm not saying I was a hot shot, but I've taken the training. And we learn to deploy those shelters. If you're deploying those shelters, it's a last-ditch effort. You're in a world of hurt at that point. That's your last line. You're praying at that point if you have to deploy one of those.
Yeah, I think I'd rather use one of those than try and drive through the fire, which we saw so many people met their demise trying to do.
Yeah. You have that stream bed in the back there. You'd be better off getting in there. So it's always wet in there. So get down in there. You could still use the shelter in there, which is probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Even if you just have a fire blanket, you could throw that over the top of you in the stream itself. That would probably be just as easy.
Speaking of which, those fire blankets, I actually have, they have portable ones that you can use in the homes for grease fires. And because who's going to try and look for the canister of flour? You go and grab the canister of flour. Oh, I forgot to refill it after I baked such and such recently. I have a fire blanket. It's already wrapped up. It's in a little pouch, and you just shake it out, and you can put it over a grease fire. And I have one in this home. I have one in my guest house and in the motor home. And it's just a great way to put something out quickly and not have to run and look for the certain ingredients. Anyway, where I'm really going with this is, it doesn't. Go ahead.
Talking home safety with that.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Everyone, and all our listeners, you should have a good, I'm not talking that little plastic one. You have a good fire extinguisher. You may spend $80.
Yes.
But it is worth having a good ABC fire extinguisher. That means it will do all your fire.
Yeah, Jeff, do me a favor. Explain ABC for people. People don't understand the differences between A, B, and C for fire, and it is a world of difference. It can cause you a world of hurt. If you do it wrong, if you have the wrong fire extinguisher for the wrong fire, I'm telling you right now, I've seen it happen. You don't want to be like putting the wrong thing on a grease fire, and you don't want to put the wrong thing on something that's like a regular combustion wood burning or a gas fire. They're, they've made specific chemicals that respond directly to the different types of fires that you could experience as a homeowner or as a renter or just someone living in a structure. Okay, let's put it that way. Do the Ted Kaczynski thing. You're in a structure. You don't understand certain types of fire extinguishers can make a fire spread if you're using the wrong fire extinguisher with a certain type of fire on how it's fueled. So you want to make sure you take a second, just a brief second, to assess. But if you have an ABC fire extinguisher, it covers all different types of fires. So I babbled enough, Jeff. I'll let you talk about the fire extinguisher types.
An A extinguisher, if you have an A extinguisher, it's more than likely a water can. And all that is good for is your woods, papers, garbage, just trash. So it's for your common combustibles. And a lot of people, I mean, a water can's a great thing. You can put out a lot of fire. There's a reason why firefighters on an engine or a ladder company carry a water can into a fire. Believe it or not, that little water can can put out a lot of fire. So an A is just simple combustibles, woods and papers and stuff. B is your liquids and gases. So if you have gasoline or grease on fire, you're going to use a B on it. C is your energized electrical stuff. So if you have a computer on fire or a TV on fire that's plugged in, you don't want to use that water can on there because you know what? It might hurt. So,
you're out of the woods, you're out of the dark, you're out of the light. Walk into the sun, walk into the light. Yeah.
So buy a good ABC. It'll cover all of them. I'm not going to get into what's in them. It's a powder, and it'll put out most fires. So just buy a good ABC. And Suzanne, before the show, we were talking about electrical cords, and since we're on this fire thing, we'll just jump into that real quick too. Sure. There was an article you read about using these. What was it, Suzanne? It's a power strip. Those power strips to energize small space heaters. And I said you should use extension cords, whether it's a power strip or just a regular extension cord, very, very sparingly in your house. So everywhere. It's not a good idea to have them ever, but especially with electrical heaters and things they're drawing so much that they heat up the cord, and eventually what you can get is a fire. So just think about things. If you have to use an electric heater, make sure you plug it directly to a wall outlet and not to extension cord to move it across the room somewhere. Move it to another room, plug it in.
And that's really good advice. And I like to talk about that as we are approaching. And some of us are actually in the winter season right now. I know you've been plowing snow. We had snow. We're expecting some more over this Thanksgiving holiday.
We had snow here too in Virginia. It snowed. It shut down the feds for a day and a half. Thank God, I feel a little more free.
That's it, huh? We need a lot more of that.
Just a little freedom.
Think about your space heaters. A lot of people are using them. And again, yes, good advice. In fact, we had some friends, for those of you that have livestock and try to keep the water from freezing, they had one of those heaters that you can dump in a water trough. And unfortunately, they used an extension cord to keep that water from freezing. And in doing so, all the animals in their barn perished. I was telling Jeff before the show, had I moved my horse out here from California, he would have been in that barn for the winter, and just a really tragic situation. So think about that fire safety, particularly as the weather gets colder. Maybe this seems really basic, but I got to tell you guys, I get so many people asking me these questions all the time. Basic preparedness. In fact, Mike Meharry even had me record an episode on basic preparedness for Ship Gold. So we'll see if they end up using it. I always feel like this stuff is so basic, nobody would really want to listen. But again, like I just said, so many people ask me these questions and have never heard of the stuff that we're saying before. So I think it's really incumbent upon us. I don't want to just do a preparedness show only because I think there are only so many times people want to hear about bug out bags. But as we're talking about timely events, the situation in California, winter is fast approaching. Think about these things in the fire safety. A lot of cooking going to be going on this weekend. Don't want to use that gas extinguisher if we get a grease fire, do we, boys and girls? And one last thing, it's always great. Look it up on YouTube if you want to see something really exciting. See what happens if you put a frozen turkey into a deep fryer. Look at it, enjoy it on YouTube, but do not try this at home. Just a little aside, it was something I just came across again yesterday.
I have to know.
Huh?
Greg teased this was before the show, and I'm dying to hear what he has to say about it.
Let's talk about Smokey the Bear. Yeah, this is something we were just going to talk a little bit about fire, but as always, I don't care what the topic is. When you get junk bond in the room, there's always going to be some esoteric plot twist, and we're going to go down that rabbit hole because it's really great, and we are so fortunate to have Greg here to take us in these directions because it's always interesting, always informative. Junk Bond, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's go talk about the Smokey the Bear.
It's Smokey Bear.
Smokey Bear, beg pardon. I was
Smokey
waiting for
Bear.
that correction.
I'll tell you. So, so yeah, in my runnings around DC here, I was presented with the information not that long ago. Somebody on the inside of something else was discussing federal policy, and let me just ask you this question first. What do you think was the most pleasant and happy episode in U.S. history? Give me a decade in the last, say, 100 years. What do you think was the happiest, best time ever that Americans had? The 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. What was it?
I kind of go back to the Roaring 20s, and I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of what we're told was the most prosperous time in American history.
Okay.
That was what I was going to guess. The Roaring 20s.
This is where now we're going to be shown how dumb we are.
Well, I'm glad you did not pick the 50s. But the 20s, although exciting and happy, were devoid of one very important piece of substance that most Americans need, and that would be alcohol. And that turned most Americans into petty criminals, which changed the face of these United States tremendously for the next 7, 8, 9 decades. Oh,
we're still paying the price for that. I'll address that in a little bit. And remember, I wrote an article called Parchment and Plants, What Prohibition Can Teach Us About the Drug War. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So, but you know the 50s. I mean, the 50s was a great time, right? The families were getting out. They're going out for camping trips. Everybody's got a white picket fence. We've got Levittown that popped up and all these other suburban communities popping up. And it turns out that all of this was a coordinated propaganda effort. This was not the way the world really was at the time. Surprise, surprise. We did learn years ago that most postmodern art was funded by the CIA, especially like Jackson Pollock and people like that, that would make things and you go, dude, I could like drop my brush on the drip mat and I've got the same thing. Why is that special? It's because we're Americans. We're trying to teach the Russians, or the evil Soviet at the time that we are much better than the Soviet. So we had to make our art better. We had to make our whole lifestyle better. We had to show them.
Under God?
What's that? Yeah, because we're under God. And
under God, yes.
Yeah, and they were under Stalin.
Right.
So one of the things we had to do was show them that we were advanced in medicine. Ergo, we get all of these new vaccines that cure all these things that don't really do anything. A good example is the polio vaccine. Polio vaccine, a number of cases of polio dropped off tremendously before the vaccine was introduced. And then after the vaccine was introduced, the number of cases of polio spiked again. So that was an ongoing propaganda campaign to show the Soviets that we were better. Well, we didn't miss any specific part of our socioeconomic enterprise here, I'll call it. And Smokey Bear, created in 1944 by a member of the U.S. Forest Service, Albert Stale, I think his name was Albert Stale, in order to tell people, to remind them to be environmentally conscious and how much better we were at doing these things. Now, this came out of the precursor to the CIA. Oh, did I say that? Yeah. So the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, had people not only working overseas, but working back here. We were building the basis, we were building the foundation at that time to ensure that we were better than the communists and that we would project a picture of moral superiority and a better lifestyle to the communists to get them to want to come over here and live the Western lifestyle, to give up on communism so they wouldn't be a threat anymore. That's the whole reason why we sent the Boston Symphony Orchestra over and toured all of the Eastern Bloc nations of Europe for year after year after year. That's part of the CIA's black budget. We did all kinds of things. So Smokey Bear was one of those propaganda tools that we used all the way through that magnificent lifestyle of the 50s, because that's where the propaganda picture was really set up and established. Everybody had a perfect way of living. Everybody was happy. You know, you even had smiley, happy cartoons that reminded you to brush your teeth with your fluoride toothpaste, right? and all senses of being able to absorb the message were covered. All of your senses were covered. There wasn't anything. There was products that were marketed in a certain way, and some of the stuff I can't get into. I don't want to. It'd be long-winded, but some products were marketed in a certain way. Companies were told to name products certain things in order, because it meant something different if you translated it into Russian. So we were all out in the Cold War days. It was much more extensive and much more intense than most people realize, in order to prove our superiority.
Let me ask you something really quick. You mentioned a black budget here to fund these. I'm assuming, for instance, when these organizations pay $1,250 for a coffee cup, they're really not putting that money in for a coffee cup. That money probably goes to something else.
Yeah, the first question I get usually is, why is the budget got to be black, Greg? What's up with that? And I would say that no, it's just the name. There's a white budget and a black budget, and the black budget funds all of those programs that you hear about later on. It's like, man, the Chinese compromised such and such. Well, certain components of that are probably in the black budget and cost $1 billion or more, probably. We were funded. One of the programs I worked on, you might remember this. One of the programs I worked on was funded by that $732 hammer back in the day. The hammer cost $3.95. And basically, the rest of it went into the black budget to fund different types of technology advancements that were going on at the time.
Probably things not listed under Article 1, Section 8, for those of us who think we need to stick with this Constitution. This is... I'm thinking
probably not.
You're shaking your head.
No, probably not. Like when was the first cell phone made? Do we know?
Nope.
Oh, I know. The 30s. The 30s. We had cell technology back in the 30s. We couldn't execute it back then, but we knew about it, and on a limited basis, we were actually able to execute and make it work. All right. Anything that you can think of that's out there I like to say out in the wild right now, there's probably a government lab somewhere. And this is what Eisenhower warned about, is having everything get into government labs or having universities funded by the government directly. You lose the ingenuity, the discovery, just the curiosity of somebody working in in their garage trying to figure something out, or taking on something at a university just because they're curious about it there, not because they're getting funded by some federal program. All of that's lost. Well, all of those things now that have been happening in the federal pipeline, we'll call it, because universities are part of the federal pipeline, and private organizations, everybody's kind of linked, like in a fascist type of a manner, to the federal government. We're going to withhold funding from you if you don't do this, or we're not going to give you funding if your proposal isn't good enough.
Well, and we see this in the media as well. And it really,
Sure.
when people wonder why the media is so biased, well, who issues their licenses? Who issues their grants for so-called public radio? It's just another branch of the government. Hence my term, the trifecta of evil: the government, the media, and the university, the education system, the latter two that are being controlled by the former. But where does Smokey Bear fit into this?
Smokey Bear was a propaganda tool, and today he still has messaging assigned to him. So propaganda tools do just one of a few things. One of them is messaging. Smokey Bear messages the strong environmental concept that Americans had towards their national forests and towards their environmental stewardship. We were responsible for what we were given. We were responsible for what we had, unlike the Soviets, who were not responsible for taking care of their natural lands and things like that.
But
We were the ones who knew what happened.
Shouldn't we? Isn't this a good thing? Don't we want the government teaching us to be responsible for our natural resources?
I don't want the government to teach me how to do anything anymore. Remember, no government's going to give you enough information to overthrow it, right? It's not going to give you the right information in order to overthrow it. So you're stuck being dumbed down with whatever it is you're going to be taught. And I think that it is important to learn environmental stewardship. Yeah, it is an important thing. But, I needed to learn from my father back in the day that a pinyon pine needs to be in the middle of a forest fire in order for its seeds to drop, right? That's the only way the pine cones open, with that intense heat that comes, and they have a natural flame deterrent built into the bark, and they survive fire after fire after fire. This is part of the natural cycle that these things go through. So if I didn't learn that from my father, I mean, what am I going to do? I'm going to learn it from the government. Sit in a government classroom all day. Pinyon pine. I wonder what that looks like. My dad was out there. We were walking around. My dad showed me.
What was that, Jeff?
The pine barrens in South Jersey are the same way. Those pine cones have to have forest fires periodically to open the pine cones up so that the seeds drop out so that they can get new trees. The pine barrens in southern Jersey are the same way.
Well, this is the problem. We have, the forest fires are a natural cycle. And in fact, we had a huge fire out in Spanish Fork, where I live, out in Utah. And again, this was complete mismanagement. And then once a lightning strike had come up in an area that was known as a wind tunnel, in fact, they have the big wind turbines there, the Department of Forestry decided we're not going to do anything about it. Again, this is a federal entity who was probably not as familiar with the areas they should have been. I don't know why this happened, but again, we can thank them for having the firefighters stand down until this was this mass conflagration. But the bottom line is, again, always be prepared, be ready to get out and have a plan. Anyway, sorry, we digress. But I love this show today. Huh?
I need to share our live chat. So we have live chat. I got to share it.
Yes.
Our friend Andrew said, when an 8-year-old kid hears that only he can prevent forest fires, well, that's a lot of pressure.
I love it. So I'm glad our chat is working. Thank you, Andrew, for chiming in. And, again, this is so refreshing to me, because when you listen to the other radio stations and these other podcasts, it's just going back and forth. The Democrats, the Republican, what did Trump do? What did Nancy Pelosi do? And I just love these conversations where people can take a break from all that and actually learn something. Anyway, the suspense is killing me. Smokey Bear.
Hold on a second. I'm sorry. So, what else you want to know about Smokey? I missed.
Well, we were talking about now, I guess he was a government propaganda tool to teach environmental stewardship.
No, actually, not necessarily to teach environmental stewardship. We would still have the problems that we had. And this is the key, is that it was to show the Soviets that we were good environmental stewards and we were sharing through the government with all the people that lived across the states here that we knew what was going on, and every person down to every kid knew exactly what was happening and exactly what was going on, exactly how to take care of the environment. And we had no worries whatsoever, because if they launched some type of a massive strike campaign or something like that against us, we knew how to take care of forest fires. They couldn't do some type of a controlled burn or something like that. Or they couldn't have a massive burn or something like that, or try to wipe out the western lands or destroy Alaska. One of their invasion plans listed that they would be able to burn through the southern part of Alaska and come down through Canada and invade. Well, we knew how to deal with that, because everybody from old man down to little baby boy knew how to deal with forest fires. We could all do it. So the messaging was directed to the Soviets that don't even try it. We know how to take care of these types of things. And every single one of our citizens is ready to go. One of the, after the wall came down, one of the admirals said, invading America is just one of those things you don't want to do, because every house has a gun. Every person is able to defend. It's not like it is in other places. We knew.
Interestingly enough, when we have this kind of information, you have to wonder why we have so many politicians seeking to disarm us, and why so many Americans are actually okay with this. Not only are our firearms are key to, again, as the founders intended, fighting off a tyrannical government, but also foreign invasion. Yes, we have a standing army. Yes, we have that. But again, we hear this time and time again, that foreign invasions are really kept at bay, not only from our standing army, but from our armed American citizenry. That's why we have to be such jealous vanguards of our pre-existing rights, not our Second Amendment rights, to maintain our firearms. Yesterday, we had Marcus Ruiz Evans from California Cal Exit come on. And when I met him in person in Dallas at the Abbeville Institute last week, he told me, I like California's firearms laws. And I said, you know what? I like Utah's firearms laws. And I'm not going to try and force my firearms rights upon you by demanding things such as national reciprocity, where I can show up having skirted any of California's concealed carry requirements and show up and pollute California with my firearms ideologies. I happen to also not like Utah's marijuana policies. I like California's marijuana policies. They're proper. It is the proper role of government. But I told him, unless we can find a way to get DC out of our lives, this is what we're going to end up with. We're going to end up with national, pardon my French, I hate the N-word, but it's appropriate here. We're going to end up with national, and we already have them in this regard, marijuana laws. The federal government has decided that marijuana is a Scheduled 1 control.
Schedule 1, yeah.
Schedule 1, like cocaine, methamphetamine. It's about as bad as it gets, meaning it has absolutely no medicinal effects. And that's in direct contravention to proven evidence. So I said back to
Have you talked to the guys that grow pot in the federal farm down in Alabama?
I have not.
They do research on it down there. There's a federal farm where you're allowed to grow pot.
So they can grow it, of course. Well, and again, now we're looking at them issuing patents. I remember when they announced that it was a Schedule 1 substance, your first thing you said was somebody paid an awful lot of money. So getting back to my conversation with Marcus, I said, if we don't try and get these people off our backs, we are going to have California's draconian, in my opinion, not his, firearms laws imposed upon us all. And we're going to have Utah's very draconian marijuana laws imposed upon everybody. And I respect his right to want to have their laws in their state, as he does in ours. That is why we had such a productive conversation, and that we can work together. when you mentioned, again, the Prohibition era, we are still suffering from that. What happened when we had Prohibition? We had massive gangster activities. The Valentine's Day Massacre, what did we get as a result of that? The 1934 National Firearms Act. Was it constitutional? Absolutely not. What did they do? Capitalize on an emergency situation that captivated headlines and ran with it, and had an active Congress that became, in fact, an Article 5 convention where nobody invited the states. So the government ignored Article 1, Section 8. They ignored the Second Amendment, put forth the National Firearms Act. And we have cases like Miller, and then we had Heller and McDonald, where the general government and our patron saint in his black robe, Antonin Scalia, saying what he believed the Second Amendment meant, and he botched it. So we have to understand the federal government, the Supreme Court, is not going to be the means by which, this is what our show focused on yesterday, Mr. Evans' position is that we need to look to the Supreme Court to stand up for them and to support their efforts in secession, notwithstanding Texas versus White. So let me give you here a little example of federalism. As we know, and I say it time and time again, certain powers were delegated to the general government, all the rest remaining with the states.
Can I ask you a question first on Texas versus White?
Yes.
Why did we reference the Articles of Confederation in that decision?
Good point.
Okay, I was just curious because I read that a few years ago, and I went back scratching my head about it. And again, I'm no constitutional legal scholar or anything like that. I just happen to be a drunk, not an alcoholic, because alcoholics go to meetings.
We go to parties.
We go to parties. That's right. And I read through it, and I was thinking to myself, well, good Lord here, why are they referencing the Articles of Confederation, the concepts that applied under the Articles of Confederation as a justification for certain things in Texas versus White, which really are kind of like abstract to me. They might be concrete or something, meaning something to you, but it didn't mean anything to me because it didn't apply, because you can't use a source document that's not a current document.
Well, and this is what's interesting also in Texas versus White, and this is what Marcus was referring to, was under Texas versus White, secession is only possible if the other states consent to it. And this is what I tried to explain to Marcus in the hallway at the convention, or at the event. I said, look, Marcus, 3 states, when the Constitution was being debated in the ratification conventions, and that was New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia, reserved the right to leave this union should it no longer work in their best interest. That term being accepted applied under the equal footing doctrine to all the other states.
Right.
It doesn't have to be in the Constitution for the states to be able to secede. That's what people don't understand. It's not in the Constitution, therefore the states can't do it. People, this is what I try to remind you of all the time. The states created the Constitution. It is the brainchild of the delegations of the states that ratified it. They created it. You hear the guy, he was on C-SPAN. He wrote the book on McCulloch versus Maryland and said the states and a nation came together and formed a compact. Kevin Goodsman said that was like being present for your own conception. But so here we are. Here we are. Let me give you an example of the federal judiciary refusing once again to rein in their own power. This was one I've been meaning. We've been so busy with hunting season back and forth and everything going on.
Rabbit season, duck season,
deer season. We have a case. This came out, and this was on. This is AP News. Kansas gun law is no defense to federal firearms charges. This is part and parcel of the inversion that Lincoln's War has put forth on our constitutional republic, which I say no longer exists. But here's how the article starts out. An appeals court on Tuesday upheld the firearms convictions against 2 Kansas men who mistakenly believed that a Kansas law can shield from federal prosecution anyone owning firearms made, sold, and kept in the state. Now, who's mistaken here? The appellants or the court and the reporters? I would say the latter. The 10th U.S. Circuit of Appeals rejected Shane Cox and Jeremy Kettler's challenges to their federal convictions under the National Firearms Act. As we said, the National Firearms Act is unconstitutional. The three-judge panel did not address the constitutionality of the state's Second Amendment Protection Act, which Kansas defended when intervening in the criminal case. Here's what the state gun law says. The state law says firearms, accessories, and ammunition manufactured and kept within Kansas borders are exempt from federal gun control. What I would say is federal gun laws and gun control are unconstitutional per se. Therefore, we are going to ignore or nullify them rather than saying because they are within the state borders, the federal gun laws don't apply. You really have to cut off the head of this snake. So how does the federal government get around this? Because clearly they have no constitutional authority to regulate, particularly, even if you want to go with this interstate commerce thing. Well, there is this case called Wickard v. Filburn. Filburn was a farmer. This was during the New Deal era who was growing grain.
I despise this case more than any other in the history of others.
Absolutely evil. Filburn was a guy growing wheat on his own property, intended to feed his own cattle and his own family. Well, as we know, in the New Deal era, the government is going to regulate now the cost of wheat and interfere with that. And they're also going to regulate how much somebody can grow. Well, Filburn said, hey, I don't apply to this because I'm not participating in interstate commerce. They were using the Commerce Clause to justify a massive power grab. Here is the stretch the court came up with. The mere fact that he was growing wheat on his own farm for his own consumption affected interstate commerce. This is absolutely nonsensical. There was another case, I think it was Garcia or Lopez. I know this sounds horrible that I'm mixing the two up. I'm sorry. It was a Commerce Clause case where the federal government sought to enforce firearms bans within 1,000 feet of schools. This was rejected as unconstitutional because they were asking local government law enforcement to enforce a federal statute. But here is the means, the stretch they used in their arguments. They used the Commerce Clause. Are you guys seeing any connection with the Commerce Clause in this one at all? Let me tell you what they came up with. Because the children could not feel safe learning in an environment where firearms might be within 1,000 feet, they could not learn. If we're going to crank out uneducated children, that's going to hurt our economy and our commerce. Therefore, the Commerce Clause applies. Thankfully, the Supreme Court turned that one down. But this is how ludicrous the arguments get. So
when I was a kid, I didn't even know what 1,000 feet were.
Right. So this is how crazy this is. This is turning on a Commerce Clause argument, and they're expecting the federal judiciary to rein back federal power. The men challenged the constitutionality of the National Firearms Act, yes, as they should, alleging it as an invalid exercise of congressional power and an invasion of the Second Amendment right to bear arms. I really don't like that. They also challenged the lower court's ruling that their reliance on state law provides no defense to the federal charges. They argued that the prosecution, so they did argue against the National Firearms Act, which they should have done as well. So I stand corrected on that. But again, are we going to expect the general government to rein in its own powers? The appeal court rejected the defense arguments in a 47-page decision. It concluded federal gun laws fall within Congress's power to tax.
Wait, a 47-page a 47-page decision to tell me that guns in Kansas, bought, sold, traded in Kansas, have to be regulated by the feds so the feds can tax.
Yes.
How many pages was the Constitution itself?
Not that many. In fact, this is what I said on my article when I wrote about Heller. Antonin Scalia says, this is the guy, the originalist, the textualist, the Constitution says what it means what it says. He took 63 pages to define what one sentence, the Second Amendment, meant, and he still got it wrong. So here's what the appellate panel also did. They rejected the request for relief for what he described as being ensnared in a constitutional dispute between Kansas and the federal government. Well, in this dispute, Kansas should, in a sane world, in a world where federalism exists, Kansas law would be on top here. Cox began selling homemade firearms and silencers out of his military surplus store. He stamped "Made in Kansas" on them to assure buyers that Kansas law would prevent federal prosecution of anyone owning firearms made, sold, and kept in the state.
Reasonable.
Yes, he also gave customers copies of the Second Amendment Protection Act, which was passed by the Kansas legislature in 2013 and signed by the governor. He even collected sales taxes.
And responsible.
His biggest selling items were unregistered gun silencers. Prosecutor said Kettler was one of the customers, was so enthusiastic about the silencer, he posted a video on Facebook. So here's the thing. We know that the general government had no authority to regulate this. The stretch with the Commerce Clause is how they're getting about this. Also, a misinterpretation of the Supremacy Clauses. Also, we hear this all the time. Well, federal law reigns supreme. The Supremacy Clause of Article 6 says so. But there's a little clause in there. It's a caveat that says that the laws of the United States and the United States Constitution made in pursuance thereof. They have to be in pursuance of the Constitution. So the Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof are the supreme law of the land.
But you see, that's not as big as the Supremacy Clause itself. So it's just a little thing. It's not that important.
Right. We can just, and it's between commas, so we can just disregard that. This is why when I point out the fallacy of looking to the Supreme Court to ultimately support the secession movement is misguided. Because when I tried to tell Marcus, look, you don't need the approval of the other states. Again, secession was legal. There has been no Article 5 amendment. Lincoln settled nothing. Might makes right is not an argument here. There has been no constitutional Article 5 convention making secession illegal. Absent that, it is legal. I was talking to a friend of mine last night. Guys, sometimes I feel like we're just talking into empty space and nobody is listening. Nobody's paying attention. A friend of mine, I first started talking to him. He said, well, I listen to Mark Levin all the time and I don't understand. I have no idea where you're coming from. And last night we had this conversation and he said, this is really starting to make sense. So we're making some headway here. So anyway, with this whole thing with secession, I explained that you cannot have a fundamental change in what was agreed to absent an Article 5 convention, because we don't have that. And this is what I said to my friend. What do you think was the reason for Jefferson Davis being released? If he was the cause, he was the leader of this rebellion, this rebellious force, which caused the death of so many hundreds of thousands of Americans, you would think they would have strung him right up, had a quick trial. Well, what do trial lawyers do? They have to come up with the defense. Well, what are they going to do to determine what his defense would be? Look into the legality of secession. The constitutional record, the ratification records are clear on the fact that it was legal at the time and continues to be. And I don't think the general government wanted that information getting out. Best let him go and rewrite history. And that's exactly what they've done. Greg, you do want to say something?
Yeah, just leave them in prison for a couple of years. Just back to the firearms thing, just for a second here.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned, and I laughed, that it was posted on Facebook about the silencers. And I just want to remind folks out there that it was published in the Federal Register a little over about a year and a half ago, that the Department of Homeland Security will be monitoring the social media accounts of anybody who's a naturalized citizen and any immigrants that come here that are on a green card status, things like that. And they also have the authority to monitor the social media accounts of people who are natural born citizens under certain circumstances. And they're not part of the intelligence community. This is part of a security effort that they cover down under TSA. They're using the TSA authorities for this. So just be aware that when the government says, well, NSA really isn't looking at your social media, well, they don't have to, because guess what? They're doing it on behalf of the Department of Helpless Security, who has a national mission, quote, national mission here, which gives them the authorities to domestically do things under certain circumstances.
So I guess the moral of the story is, if you want to show these things, make sure you're in one of those groups that says it's secret or to friends only, right? Because they won't see that.
I would take, well, yeah, sure, right, yeah, not a chance. Anytime you're in a group with people, you better doggone well make sure you know who they are, because part of the security stuff is that they pretend to be, or they're sock puppets, is what we call them in the security world, sock puppets, that they're not a real person, they're just a profile, and that profile is somebody who's collecting information on you and everybody else.
I also want to touch on this one subject as we wrap up the show here. This has been going out. We had a Democratic representative from California, Eric Swalwell, and there was a conversation about the gun confiscation. As we know, we're having these red flag laws. Somebody in Maryland just got killed as a result of that. Police went to go and seize his firearms pursuant to one of these red flag law orders. And here's the thing. The guy ended up getting killed. They went after him because they were afraid he was going to commit suicide. They go to his house at 5 o'clock in the morning. Who here is going to go and answer the door at 5 o'clock in the morning? So,medy's banging on your door and not have a firearm on them. That was just absolutely stupid. So here, wanted to just address, beg your pardon, this guy here, Representative Swalwell, when somebody said it was going to start a civil war if you're going to take up our firearms, what he said is, we have the nukes. It's going to be a short war. Here we have a member of the general government where firearms under the Constitution are not even allowed to be regulated, threatening to use nuclear weapons on American citizens if they don't hand over their firearms. I said yesterday, this is about as preposterous as imagining a president going to war against the American people to collect a tax.
Well, I wouldn't put it past the government to launch and do stuff to folks. Like I mentioned before, the government's been doing things to people for years. We've had the CIA has released mosquitoes in different places in Florida in order to see the human reaction, population reactions to different types of toxins that the mosquitoes carried. They used the MK Ultra program in order to do psychotropic medication testing and other actual surgical testing on people. So don't be surprised when the government says they're going to attack you or do something like that, because it's been done before. They have a track record. And, like you say, you might be able to trust somebody superficially to an extent, but you get that really warm, fuzzy feeling from them, from their track record.
Yes. And speaking of MK Ultra, you have a new Liberty Minutes posted up on our SoundCloud page, and I believe also our Facebook page, and it should also be on YouTube. I want to encourage everybody to go and listen to that. We're going to wrap up the show, Greg, real quick. I've got 15, 20 seconds. Go, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
I got that one, and I got one on the Great Society and poverty, too, and how poverty actually became worse after the Great Society programs were implemented.
As it was intended to, as the war on drugs, as is the war on terror. I want to thank you always. I appreciate your insight as to these situations. Smokey Bear, who would have thought it? Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us today. Greg Carpenter, Junk Bond, thank you for joining us. Jeff Johnson, thank you for keeping this show running. I'm Suzanne Sherman. This is the Cerberus Radio Network, where we defend liberty and freedom from the flames of tyranny. Thank you for listening.